With me now to discuss all of this from the Heritage Foundation is Hans von Spakovsky. Welcome back, Hans.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So we've talked about this bill on the show in the past, but remind some of our viewers about the more radical measures that were included in the final version of H.R. 1 that recently passed the House.
Well, it would make it impossible for states, for example, to enforce a voter ID law. Since the law mandates they have to allow anyone to vote as long as they simply sign a form saying that they are who they say they are. It would get rid of witness signature requirements for absentee ballots, basically making it very more difficult to authenticate that it was really the voter who signed the ballot. It's just one provision after another like that contained throughout this bill. Biden said it was landmark legislation. No, it's reckless legislation that would destroy election integrity.
And we just heard from Biden. He was saying that this was in some ways in response to what he calls, or what he claims is Republicans trying to suppress the vote. What do you make of his remarks?
That is this narrative myth the left has been pushing for years, claiming that if you are concerned about the security and integrity of the election process, you're somehow suppressing votes. And that's just not the case. Georgia, for example, is working on a bill that would extend their voter ID requirement, which has been in place for 10 years with no problems, to absentee balloting. That's a smart move. It's something that other states ought to follow. That would be prohibited if H.R. 1 passes the Senate.
Is there anything in H.R. 1 that addresses election integrity, for example? For many Republicans, especially following November 3rd, that's a big deal for many Republican voters. Is there anything that would strengthen our election security, our election integrity with this H.R. 1 bill? Because, for example, I know it would limit the ability for states to, for example, clean up their voter rolls. That's a big red flag for me.
Well, there's a lot. It's all red flags. No, there's not a single thing in here that would improve election integrity. Almost every single provision in it would hurt election integrity. Another example of this is same-day voter registration. It would require states to allow people to register and immediately vote on election day. That gives election officials no time whatsoever to verify the information being given by the voter. Combine that with no voter ID, and basically anyone could go into any polling place anywhere, make up a name, register, vote, and their chances of being caught are almost slim to none.
And another big issue for many people on November 3rd was by that night, President Trump seemed to be ahead in many of these states. And then by the next day, we saw then Biden, of course, taking the lead in a lot of those states. And so many voters felt like they were in limbo. So with H.R. 1, does that turn, instead of having election day, it seems like we'll have election season with such early voting and then ballots being accepted up to days after the election?
Yeah, in fact, it requires every state to have at least 14 days of early voting. And it says that states have to accept absentee ballots, can you believe this, for up to 10 days after Election Day. So if folks were upset they didn't know the results of the election after Election Day with a 10-day deadline, it could be weeks before we know the results of future elections if they're close.
And how can the federal government, the Congress in this case, take so much power over elections when I thought that it was the Constitution that gave that power to the states to determine how they will send up their elections?
Well, the Constitution does give this authority to the states, but it does give Congress the ability to intervene, but only with regard to certain aspects of the election process. There are parts of this bill that are blatantly unconstitutional. There are other parts that, while they might not be unconstitutional, they're really bad legislation that's going to hurt the election system that we have in this country.
And what do you think are the chances of it passing through the Senate? We know there are some moderates in the Senate, for example, Senators Manchin and Sinema. What do you think are the chances of it passing through with some moderate support? Or do you think that some of these moderate Democrats might break from their party on this issue?
Well, I would hope they would. All it takes is one vote to defeat it. And I would think they would want to look at this and realize that even if there are parts of this bill they might like, that their home state legislators and their home state voters should be very upset at the idea that they will no longer get to decide what the rules are for elections in their state. Instead, it's coming out of a one-size-fits-all rule from the U.S. Congress.
And then here we sit now, several dozen of these lawsuits from November of 2020, whether they were brought by President Trump, by the Republican Party, or from various other state officials. Now, pretty much all of them now have either not been taken up by the courts or just dismissed, dropped, what have you. Recently, we saw it was the Supreme Court. A Pennsylvania case came up and they didn't decide to hear it. We saw Justice Clarence Thomas said it was inexplicable why the rest of his colleagues wouldn't take up this case. And of course, it would settle at least some of the questions that are being asked, especially with regard to H.R. 1, with ballots being mailed in late, coming in after the appointed date for the election. Do you think in some ways the courts, whether it's the Supreme Court or the lower courts, kind of dropped the ball by not hearing any of these cases?
I think the federal courts evaded their responsibility. I think they used procedural gimmicks to get rid of the cases instead of doing what they should have done, which is investigating the credibility and substance of the allegations being made. And I think it was a real dereliction of duty by these federal judges.
Hans, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.